All right, so I just received authorization that I'm good to go. So I'd like to thank you for the invitation again and a chance to talk with you on what's really quite an extraordinary period of time. I just got back from a very quick trip to Europe and had some time in Vienna to meet with some key people on the European financial side of things, and I'll report to you on that. But I want to just start by situating the strategic situation in the context that Lyndon LaRouche has been discussing it. And let me just start by saying that there are a lot of people who would second guess Lyndon LaRouche, who would say, well, he's been around for a long time, maybe he's losing his touch. He's been predicting the possibility of thermonuclear war. It never happened, so why should we trust him? I mean, it's sort of funny that you're disappointed that LaRouche said we could have thermonuclear war and we didn't have it. You have to realize that LaRouche's forecasts are designed in part to preempt the worst possibilities, and that he's operating from a sense of history that starts with the idea that we're not dealing with a series of discrete, predetermined events that occur in a fashion of one event after another based on some previous experience that the world has undergone. That there's always the basis of human intervention. And that for LaRouche, his focus is on the activation of that higher quality of human creative mentation, which can allow mankind to not just avoid the worst crises, but to foresee them before they occur and take action, not just to avoid them, but to overcome the kind of thinking that leads to those crises. Now, with that said, it should be noted that throughout human history, there have always been people who have been forecasters, some better than others. But one of the great tragedies is that many of those forecasters have been treated as the mythical figure from Homer, Cassandra. That is, she is condemned to being an accurate forecaster, but no one believes her. And so most of human civilization or human history has been tragedy, because those people who made it their business to understand the process of the unfolding of history, their warnings often fell on deaf ears. Or to put it another way, something that many of you may have experienced. You go out and tell someone something which you know to be true, and their response is, it'll never happen. You can't win. You can't beat them. You know, in Texas, we have a particular form of impotent populism, which you may have some familiarity with in Canada, which basically says, well, there's no way to change things. You can't fight City Hall. There's something more powerful out there that is determining our destiny. And you're going to hear in the following presentation about a young woman who didn't believe in that, Jeanne d'Arc, who didn't believe that history was predetermined. She did something that's impossible, that 99% of the people you talk to sitting in cafes in Montreal would say, it'll never happen. Are you kidding? An uneducated peasant girl lead the armies of France to defeat England? No way. What are you smoking? And what was it that Jeanne d'Arc represented? It was a willful intention on her part to undertake something that may have seemed impossible, but which she acted in such a way that forced other people to give up their pessimism and participate in a process of change. Now, that's how history is made. That is, when history is made for the good. Generally, history is made because of a bunch of corrupt, immoral oligarchs imposing their will on pessimistic, depressed, cynical people who submit to the idea that you can't win. Now, what we've been fighting for the 40-something years that I've known Mr. LaRouche, is not specific policies. We've always had policy options, whether it was the International Development Bank in the late 1970s, Operation Juarez to fight the debt crisis in the early 1980s, the Strategic Defense Initiative, just to name a few. And now the 4 basic laws of LaRouche, Glass-Steagall, the Hamiltonian credit policy, massive funding and infrastructure, and the 4th point is that the use of helium-3 and the development of the fusion economy as the real driver for that infrastructure. So we've always had programs and solutions. But what's always been the purpose of the LaRouche movement? It's to challenge the existing ideas that form popular opinion. Now, popular opinion is very insidious because most people don't realize they're controlled by popular opinion. Most people have an ego which says, well, I'm unique. Yes, I'm going along with my friends, but I have my own view. I have my own opinions. And as you know, opinions aren't worth very much because opinions can be wrong. The question is, can you present an argument to someone that goes beyond opinion, that gets at a higher truth based on a principle of how the human civilization should be organized? And to do that, it's not to fight with someone over whether this policy or that policy is better. Or to take a perfect example with populists in the United States, you say, look, there's more than enough evidence to impeach Obama. And they'll say, well, if you get rid of him, they'll just put someone else in. Now, that's an ad hominem idiotic argument that is the source for that argument is, don't bother me, I'm too busy to get involved in what you want me to do. Which means that people are willing to take the consequences of their inaction, even if it means thermonuclear war, even if it means a global financial collapse or the spread of disease or other horrible afflictions. Because that statement of you can't win comes from a fear on the one side that you're not important, and therefore what's the whole point of your life? But on the other side, you can't, the fear is that even if you wanted to, you couldn't move other people. And fortunately for human history, Jeanne d'Arc didn't think that way. Neither did Johannes Kepler, or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, or Ben Franklin, or Douglas MacArthur. There are people in history, or Lyndon LaRouche, people in history who seem to be marginal figures, who suddenly emerged as unique creative geniuses who changed the direction of history. Now, Lynn has a record of being consistent, of fighting for this principle of the difference between man and animal, that we as human beings possess a capability to change the circumstances not just of ourselves, but of our whole species, of making discoveries of principle that can be applied as science to create new technologies, new innovative practices that can increase the power of each individual human being living in that society. That's what economics is about. The whole point of economics is not how to get rich or how to produce a lot of money. It's how do you increase the physical productive power of each person who's in the labor force to add to the total productive capability available for mankind. This is what productivity really is. You develop ideas that can enable you to produce more than you consume. And it's that surplus which can then be monetized in the form of credit, which enables you to advance a civilization. So that's what our fight has been all these years, to bring to the fore those people within institutions of government or outside of institutions of government, but who represent some kind of capability, to bring to them ideas that are outside of the realm of what's generally accepted. And by that I mean to introduce the kinds of policies and understanding of what's shaping history, so that we're not doomed to continue in the same direction, but actually have a possibility of moving in a totally new direction. Now, the direction we're in right now is a horrible one. And I can tell you it's very interesting, having been in Europe this last week. I went to Vienna for a couple of days, and Vienna has something in common with Montreal. It's one of these cafe cultures where people are excited by ideas, but very smug. They're smug in their sense of impotence. They love to sit around over a cup of coffee and expound on everything. And one of the problems I have when I'm in Vienna is I don't know how to stretch a cup of coffee over 3 hours. You get into these discussions that go on and on and on, and I drink a cup of coffee in about 3 or 4 minutes. And I'm with people who take 2.5 hours to drink a very small espresso. So to them, there's a certain timelessness. Their ideas are not crucial for mankind. The proof is they have all this time to waste basically engaging in verbal masturbation. And some of it's very interesting, the ideas anyway. But the question comes up of what are you going to do now with the European monetary system, which is blowing apart, which is being challenged by Greece. And it's ironic, isn't it? Greece represents 3% of the EU in terms of its monetary and financial contributions, or size, GDP. And yet it's virtually toppling the European financial system. Why is that the case? And that's where you see the problem of debt. You see the problem of an overhang of debt, which instead of being written off, when it was clear in 2008, 2009, it was unpayable and unredeemable, non-fungible, you might say. Instead of recognizing that and starting to write it down, what they did is they created a various series of bailout procedures to put more liquidity to back up the bad debt. And this was in the argument of people like Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank, following in the footsteps of Ben Bernanke from the US Federal Reserve. The whole purpose of quantitative easing was to keep liquidity in the system, as though liquidity is some great god of economic necessity. Now, you have an irony, which was described to me by a leading economist, the former chief economist of the Bank of International Settlements, who, by the way, is a Canadian, a man named William White, very interesting character. William White said the problem is not liquidity, it's solvency. What happens when your banking system is filled with bets that are unpayable? If you win the bet, it's unpayable, so you double down and try and make it a bigger win. If you lose the bet, you can't cover the costs. So you go out and you buy a bet on a bet, something called risk insurance or credit default swaps, or naked default swaps as they're now called. Now, what does this mean? It means that you have what was set up to be a political system, the European Union, which is primarily a mechanism for a banker's dictatorship over the formerly sovereign states of Europe. And when a country gets into trouble, they're forced to go to the deities, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and the European Central Bank, to borrow money to pay off back debt. And as any of you know who have large credit card debt, and you go out and get a new credit card to pay the old credit card debt, the amount of debt you have actually grows even as you're paying off what you thought was the initial amount of debt. It doesn't work. You never extinguish a debt by going into a debt to pay the debt. That's the difference between a debtor system, a monetarist system which is centered around financial trading, versus a physical productive system in which wealth is determined not by circulation or flow of money, but by the ability to increase the power of labor to produce the goods that are necessary for the next phase of human advance. And so the EU was not set up to allow the standard of living to improve in the poorer parts of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Southern Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, in Ireland, in Croatia, in Slovenia, in Romania. It was to set up accounting mechanisms so that those countries which had credit in the form of debt made available to them would be able to redeem the debt by borrowing more and going deeper into debt. That's the problem in the EU. And so you sit down and talk to one of these bankers and you say, well, how is this quantitative easing going to work? And they say, oh, well, the money's going to go to the banks, and the banks will invest it in small and medium enterprises, and that will start up production. And so I asked them, I said, well, is there a mechanism to force them to make loans to productive enterprises? Well, no, that wouldn't be freedom. We believe in free trade. Well, then what's to stop the banks from taking that money and putting it into more speculative instruments? Well, nothing, except we're hoping that they'll put it into something productive, which they know isn't going to happen. Because if you start investing in the volume and kinds of infrastructure that's needed in Europe, improved transportation, water management, power development, you don't get an immediate return. Whereas if you find a sucker to sell a credit default swap to, like a city or a utility district, you can make a nice profit right on as you first sell it, and then when you buy it and you sell it again, you trade it again, you make another profit. So banks are going to go for the short-term profit. Well, and they say yes, but in the long range it will improve. Why? Because the euro is going to parity with the dollar, 1-to-1 with the dollar, which they say will cheapen the cost of exports from Europe, which will allow for more exports. And I asked them, well, how do you cheapen the cost of exports with that? Just because the euro's dropping? Well, no, it means European labor will become more competitive with Chinese labor. And how is that? Well, it'll suppress wages. Now, in other words, their whole system can only stay stable if they lower the wages in Europe. This is what they call labor reform. This is what Scott Walker of Wisconsin, this lunatic who they're promoting as a presidential candidate, this is his whole thing. Tax cuts and wage cuts. Although he won't call them wage cuts, he calls it right to work. So they have a system which is collapsing, which requires them to go for deeper and deeper cuts. Now, this impelled them to look for other sources of loot. And that's why they tried to hook Russia and China into the existing transatlantic financial system. And the Russians said no, the Chinese said no. And all of a sudden we're hearing of the Asia pivot and the necessity of stopping Putin's aggression. Putin's aggressiveness is what? Trying to seize part of Eastern Europe? No, he's aggressive in defense of the interests of the Russian nation. And so, driven by the financial desperation of a failed model, the elites of London and Washington, with Obama in a key position as a puppet of these elites, is threatening a war against Russia and China and keeping the United States in permanent warfare in the Middle East for the sake of propping up worthless financial papers held as part of the liquidity of the global banking system. That's why we face World War III, and that's what Lyndon LaRouche has been emphasizing. Now, the problem is that if you break with that policy, you're called a Putin apologist or a Neville Chamberlain. If you say, well, maybe we should talk to the Chinese, they say, well, that's the Munich solution from World War II, appeasing Hitler. We have to be tough. We can't do that. We can't appease the terrorists. Well, then why do we ally ourselves with a leading funder and coordinator of global terrorism, the Saudis. So you look at all these ironies and what do you see? It doesn't add up. They're telling more and more lies to get people to accept the idea that there's no alternative. And then let's take the last of these lies, the argument that the US economy is improving because of quantitative easing and because of Obama's stewardship. And this is what the Europeans should do. Now, it was fun for me to poke at the Europeans while I was there and say to them, do you really think the Americans have solved these things? And I pointed out the last 3 months, each month, manufacturing in the United States has contracted, while Obama is going out there telling people we're having a manufacturing renaissance. Where? Manufacturing new forms of video porn? That's the new manufacturing renaissance? So you look at the reality and you see that the jobs created since 2009 are on the whole short-term, temporary, and low wage. There's no expansion or significant improvement in the physical existence of cities. In fact, they've worsened. We have a drought crippling the country from the central part of Texas all the way out to California. And it's also, by the way, a drought in Oregon and parts of Washington. The snowfall was much lower this year than it's been in the past. These are the most productive farmlands, especially California and West Texas in the country. They're not producing. So we have this lie that we're in a great recovery. What's the recovery? Well, banks are borrowing money from the Federal Reserve at 0% interest. They were getting money from quantitative easing, and then that's been slowed down. But they still have the 0% interest. So what do they do with that money? Are they looking for entrepreneurs? Well, maybe Instagram or those kinds of entrepreneurs who become billionaires with companies that have 30 employees. What is it? Snapchat, I think, has 13 employees, and they sold for, I think, $9 billion. Created 3 new billionaires overnight to be able to send pictures and talk. This is not exactly a manufacturing renaissance. So you have these bubbles that have been created. A stock bubble. The US stock market is going through the roof again. Companies that are not producing a profit in their manufacturing or their product line have their stock going up because they're borrowing money at low interest rates and buying their own stock. And Obama is calling that a recovery. Now, most Americans realize that the situation is not good. They don't know that we face thermonuclear war because you have a bunch of maniacs who think we probably could bluff Russia to back down. And if we didn't bluff them, we could launch a first strike, knock out their retaliatory capabilities with our first strike and with cyber warfare, and win a limited nuclear war. That's being discussed by the people who are working with Obama in the counter to Russia, the anti-Russian policy. So most Americans don't know that, but they know that we're facing a tough situation in the Middle East. The Ukraine situation doesn't appear to be getting better. We're coming to the moment of decision on Iran. And their uncle is unemployed and living on their couch, and their kids just graduated from college with $100,000 in debt and no chance to get a job. So people are frustrated, they're angry. But that in itself doesn't change things. Individual actions change things. And there were 3 individuals last week who did something that started to shift the whole discussion. One was a kind of nondescript guy named Frank-Walter Steinmeier, foreign minister of Germany. But he came to the United States, and he came a couple days after legitimate, real Nazis from Ukraine had come to lobby Congress to get more weapons to fight Russia. And Steinmeier came, and after his meetings with Kerry, he was asked about arming Ukraine. And he said he thinks it's a bad idea. He said, we should believe in diplomacy. The Normandy group or the Minsk process is working. The ceasefire is holding. Now, he didn't go far enough. He didn't say, if we stop funding Nazis in Kiev, we could solve the problem. But he did make the point that arming Ukraine would be a big mistake. Now, he was joined in this almost at the same time by a former German chancellor named Helmut Schmidt. Some of you may remember Schmidt was the chancellor in the late 70s when he and Giscard d'Estaing were beginning to move towards something called the European Monetary Fund. And this was a proposal of Lyndon LaRouche's, that it would not just be a monetary fund, but it would be a seed crystal for investment in physical production. And it never fully became that, but Schmidt was, to some extent, among that grouping in Germany that saw that the future was in technology, was in industry, and was in trade with the East. Now, Schmidt is about LaRouche's age. I think he's just turned 92. And Schmidt, in an interview, said, if we fail to recognize that Putin has legitimate concerns with what we're doing in Ukraine and moving NATO eastward, then we risk creating a hot war. And this was an electric shock in Germany. So you had Steinmeier on Ukraine and Schmidt on Ukraine. Then we had something interesting in the United States. As most of you know, we're going to have a presidential election in what, about 20-something or 16 months or 18 months, something like that. And everybody's talking about the inevitability of Hillary versus Jeb, which is about as terrible an option as you could have, besides being very boring. And then you have a whole slew of these complete lunatics on the Republican side, from Ted Cruz of Texas, who really wants to go back to the Confederacy. Rand Paul, who's decent in not wanting to fight wars, but a complete nut when it comes to economics. I could run through the whole roster, but it gets a little sickening. And what do you have on the Democratic side? We have a couple of people out there who are saying we got to do something about income inequality, but without a program. Elizabeth Warren, who's not going to run, has been hinting that Glass-Steagall, in fact, she introduced the Glass-Steagall bill, but hasn't made it a major feature of what she's been doing. But all of a sudden, the governor of Maryland, former governor of Maryland, a man named Martin O'Malley, announced in New Hampshire and then Iowa and then Washington, D.C., or actually Washington first, then New Hampshire and Iowa, that the too big to fail problem is the problem in the United States, that Dodd-Frank was not a solution, that we must go to Glass-Steagall. And if banks are too big to fail, they're too big, and they have to be broken down in size. And this was the closest someone has come of an official candidate to bringing up the necessity of the first point of LaRouche's 4 basic laws. And he said more than that. You can go on our website to see what else he said. But the significant thing is you had 3 individuals who came out from different standpoints and different backgrounds to verge on a picture of the world that conforms to that which we in the LaRouche movement have been presenting. Now, in each case, they stop short of what's necessary, which is why we have to do our job. Because the real solution here is that you've got to break the power of Wall Street and the City of London. We have to end this idea that economics is a process of accumulating money, and instead get people to understand that economics is the means by which human creativity is used to increase the potential for mankind in the future. And the potential meaning to live longer, to live healthier, to be more productive, to be more creative, to become more beautiful human beings who don't engage in a competitive struggle with other nations and other religions and other tribes, but actually engage in a higher process of development of the human race as a whole. And that's what we bring to this fight. The fact is we have the solutions. We have the economic solutions. It will work. Glass-Steagall will work because it would force the investment banks to operate without a government backup. Now, what I know, what they say today is, well, don't worry, we're not going to bail anyone else out. You think the government's going to let Citicorp go under? They have $171 trillion in derivatives. That's 10 times the size of the US GDP. If they start cratering their financial paper, which is being held by Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, BNP Paribas, they're all going to have to move to be backed up. And so you're going to have something that's bigger than September 2008, which can't be done. That's when the whole thing blows. And so Glass-Steagall represents the starting point for addressing that. The very beginning of the policy to shift from a speculator, financier system to a system of Hamiltonian physical production. And that's where we have the potential now. And so on the one side, you see a group of elites who are, I think it's fair to say, they're insane. The idea that some of these people are thinking that you could fight and win a limited nuclear war. And let me tell you, they're saying this in public. And there are criticisms of them coming out in public. Theodore Postel, an MIT physicist who worked on the strategic arms team with the Ronald Reagan administration, has written a couple of articles, one of which said, the belief that you could fight and win a limited war is in itself the provocation to lead to a nuclear war. There have been others who have made similar comments, from Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, the former Democrat and Republican leaders of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, former senators. There are others who have said this. Daniel Ellsberg has brought this up. Ellsberg, I was just reading his, for those of you who don't know, Daniel Ellsberg was sort of the Snowden of the 70s. He's the one who leaked the Pentagon Papers that demonstrated that the U.S. knew that we couldn't win the Vietnam War even as we were escalating. But Ellsberg's background was in strategic bombing and limited nuclear war. And he was with a group of people who said the idea of preparing to fight a limited nuclear war is completely insane. As Einstein and Douglas MacArthur had said, after Hiroshima, the idea that you could solve people's problems by war is insane. And yet we still have planners who think they can do it. And they think they can limit the damage to Eurasia because of our cyber warfare capabilities to disarm a Russian second strike or retaliatory strike, as well as our missile defense and our advanced placement. And against the wishes of Europe, we're talking now about replacing the 180 tactical nuclear weapons in the frontline states of Europe with brand new, better targeted, more powerful so-called tactical or limited nuclear weapons. For what reason? To fight a war with Russia? Why? So when we say these are insane ideas, they are. But this is what the president supports. This is what most of the idiots in the Senate, especially the Republicans, but even a lot of the Democrats, are playing around with. So what LaRouche has said is we've got to remove Obama, either remove him from office or have him placed under some kind of control so that he has no more freedom of action on these things. Secondly, go with the economic policies against Wall Street. And that's how we can move the country ahead. Now, I want to come back to what I started with and what you're going to be discussing later. The lesson of the heroic Jungfrau von Orleans, Joan of Arc. Here was a woman who rallied a nation, an individual who acted on the basis of a deeply felt belief. Now, we don't know exactly where the voices came from that she heard, but she believed in them. And she was willing to give up her life to save her nation from the marauding of the British or the English during this 100 Years' War. And that example inspired a network of thinkers, including Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, a grouping called the Brothers of the Common Life, who actually took up the idea that ideas, that the ideas of Plato, the discoveries in science, can be used to change the relations among people. And people who are willing to risk everything to fight for truth. This is the most profound and beautiful concept of man that exists in our Western culture. You know, the idea that it's through art, through music, through drama, that you bring forward ideas into the popular realm to transform the imagination from one which spends its time trying to figure out how I'm going to get laid or make a lot of money or get high, into really thinking about how we can explore the solar system and the universe for the benefit of future generations. And it's that fight that we're calling you to join us to wage. That fight. Not simply a fight for Glass-Steagall or a fight for Nawapa or a fight for some specific. All the specifics are there. But the fight is to transform the way people think about what it means to be human, so that we can create a society which operates not from a standpoint of a struggle for the survival of the fittest, but for a cooperative effort to realize the common aims of mankind. And that's what LaRouche represents, and that's why he takes the biggest fights and fights them from the highest level, the highest standard. Because nothing short of that will succeed, except at the most for a very, very brief instant. If you don't change the way people think, you might be able to momentarily put something through that's a good policy, but it's not sustainable. If you change the way people think about themselves and their fellow human beings, then you create a new paradigm. And that's what our job is. So why don't I leave it at that and see if you have some questions for me. I assume we can do some questions with this. Okay, let me just see what you texted to me. Yes, I will take some questions. So I'm waiting for your call. Hello? All right, just a second. Okay, I think it's muted. Hello. all right, let me answer. Okay, I want to answer your first assumption because I don't think it's accurate that we would not have a war. I agree with you. The U.S. military is not as powerful as some think it is. People who know that include the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's been doing everything possible to not engage in war. There are people in the military who realize that we've had a stupid policy called the War on Terror, that it's cost trillions of dollars, it's cost thousands of American lives, and probably over 1 million to 2 million lives in countries that we've attacked. It's made more enemies than friends. It's had no military victories. And they also know that you can't win a nuclear war. There are no winners in that. However, you do have a grouping who are utopians, who actually believe that these new weapons have a capacity to disarm an enemy. Now, in normal society, those people would be either locked up or stuck in an ivory tower somewhere. Under the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and back before that, Bush 1 and even during parts of the Reagan administration, these were people who were given free rein to map out the next war. Now the question, so in the first part, in order to carry out an effective bluff, which essentially the belief is they can use sanctions and other means to bluff the Russians into backing down. But for that to really work, you have to be prepared to actually use the weapons, and that's where the danger comes in. Now, your second point is absolutely on the mark. Inside Washington, I mean, LaRouche is basically saying we should, with the exception of just going in there and telling the congressmen what a bunch of corrupt whores they are, we should stay out of Washington. But changing the country requires literally a two-pronged approach. And what we're doing with our limited forces is we are going out to campuses, to unions, to certain libertarian groups, to progressive organizations, to civil rights organizations, and challenging them to take back the country. But at the same time, we're waging a battle for intellectual hegemony in the institutions that are not fully corrupted and controlled. These include groups like the Veterans for Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, retired military and intelligence types who speak out on these issues regularly, including people who have joined us recently, such as Chaz Freeman, the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, John Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia under Reagan and Bush, who initially said to us, oh, look, there won't be a war, don't worry about it. And then after he studied it a little bit, he went and did a press conference in Washington, D.C., where he said, we're stumbling towards nuclear war and there's no reason for it. So, you do have these kinds of networks, college professors, think tankers, retired political figures that we're talking to and we're engaging with to get them to join us in this fight. Now, the question is not to separate from Washington. It's to create a terror in the minds of the people in Washington that if they continue to act for the global bankers against the interests of the American people, they're going to end up with serious consequences, including jail, including getting thrown out of office and so on. But to do that, you have to mobilize the population and you have to mobilize within the institutions to create a blowback. So that's how we're approaching it. That's what we're doing. But don't believe that there's not a danger of war, because there's a very important book that was written this last year called Sleepwalking into World War I. And we're doing the same thing because we're assuming that Putin is not going to react to the provocations. And so far, Putin has reacted very cleverly. But there's a limit to what they're willing to accept, and the deployment of new nuclear weapons NATO forces in Poland and elsewhere, that does represent a serious threat to the Russian people, and they may respond. So, next question. I'm sorry, there's a question, I didn't hear it. Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, sure, sure. Actually, I missed one important point that I should have brought up, which is that what we're mobilizing for are these four basic laws of LaRouche. One is Glass-Steagall, separation of commercial and investment banks, which would force the writing down of the worthless paper that's being propped up by bailouts, 0% interest, and so on. Secondly, the establishment of a Hamiltonian credit policy, a National Bank of the United States, with the idea that the Treasury would issue credit based on the requests of Congress that would make credit available through the banking system outside of the Federal Reserve, through a national bank that would generate credit that would go into the community banks, the regional banks, and the larger commercial banks that need credit to stimulate manufacturing and production. The third point of that is that it would go into primarily, as a starting point, infrastructure, massive projects, high-speed rail, nuclear power, water management, creation of water for the Western United States through desalination, through experimentation on how you can unleash the rivers of water above the atmosphere, and so on. And then fourth, investment in nuclear fusion. But this would not just be a U.S. policy. And I should have included this in the body of my remarks. What's unique now is that there's a grouping in the world called the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who are moving precisely on this LaRouchean idea of investment in physical production. The Chinese call it the Silk Road, or we called it the Eurasian Land Bridge. The connection of the world through high-speed rail, a maritime Silk Road, upgrading of ports, building of new canals like the improvement of the Suez Canal in Egypt and the new Panama Canal through Nicaragua. Investment in connecting by high-speed rail the cities of Africa, not just internal to the continent, like from Cape Town in South Africa up to Cairo, but then through the Middle East and into the old traditional Silk Road to China and to Siberia. That the BRICS have put forward an idea of a new development bank, which was then backed up by a really interesting proposal called an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China initiated and offered to President Xi of China, offered to President Obama during the summit in Beijing a couple months ago that the U.S. could join them. Now, Obama basically said no, and he's continuing to push this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade agreement that would eliminate what sovereignty is left. Now, what's interesting is in the last week, the United Kingdom, the British, said they'd like to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And Obama sent them a note saying this would be a big mistake. It would be giving too much credibility to China. It would basically saying it's appeasing the Chinese. And within 48 hours, the Germans, the French, and the Italians said they want to join. Now the South Koreans are moving, the Australians, the Swiss are joining this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the Chinese newspaper Xinhua had an editorial today titled, "So Washington, what are you waiting for?" The rest of the world is moving on toward this development course. This is what the City of London and Wall Street are trying to stop. So it's from that standpoint, if we can eliminate the power of Obama by either impeaching him because he's eminently impeachable, or by just getting people to step in and say, Mr. President, you can do your basketball predictions, you can sit in your room and watch ESPN 24 hours a day, but we're not going to let you make policy anymore. And move Obama out of there, and then get these 4 basic laws in, and have the United States then join the BRICS, join with the BRICS. And that's how we would solve this thing. Now on our website, there's quite a bit of material about the BRICS. We have a special report, a land bridge report, which you probably can get through the office there. We have a LaRouchePAC pamphlet on what the BRICS policy represents that's available, so you can get more details from that. And we also have a resolution we're circulating worldwide. I'm actually coordinating a task force in the United States to get signatures from prominent people to support rejection of geopolitical confrontation and replacement of that with a commitment to cooperation for the common interests of mankind. So I would encourage people to read through that resolution if you haven't yet, and make it your resolution. Take it around to the people you know, whether they're students, co-workers, people at church. Get them to sign it, and more importantly, get them to fight for the ideas in it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Okay. Look, this is a very complex situation because the Greek people rejected austerity and voted in Syriza. And since the new government has come in, their popularity has gone up because they said we're not going to accept the terms of surrender that were imposed on Greece by the so-called Troika, the IMF, the European Commission, and the ECB, the European Central Bank, in which Greece has been loaned $260 billion to pay their old debts, of which less than 10% of that ever went to Greece and was spent in Greece. 90% of that 260 billion euros went to the banks, primarily German, French, and Spanish banks. But the point is they now owe that 260 billion plus interest even after they've paid the 260 billion. This is what my colleague Dennis Small calls banker's arithmetic. The more you borrow to pay debt, the more you owe, even though you've paid down the original debt. So the Greek government is saying they're not going to do that. Now the media, especially the pro-IMF, pro-Wall Street media, keeps saying the Greeks are making a deal, they're selling out, they're going to have to capitulate. And on the other side, you have Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany, who's taking the hard line, saying you have to stick with the IMF policy. We don't care if it's cut your country's economy by 25%. We don't care if half your youth or more than half your youth are unemployed. You haven't done enough yet to make yourself creditworthy. Then you've got others who are saying, well, maybe we can work a little deal here or there, but don't upset the apple cart. Now, Schäuble is now saying, let Greek exit. We don't care. Let the Greeks go. But they do care, because if Greece gets away with this, then why would Spain, why would Italy, why would Portugal kill their population to pay the debt? So it's an existential crisis. And up to this point, Syriza, Tsipras, Kamenos, and the leaders have not sold anything out. They have not backed down. And so you have a stalemate for another 3 months while they negotiate the terms of the so-called reform. Now, the Greeks are doing something interesting here. What they're saying is that this is not about Greece, it's about Europe. The policy toward Greece was wrong and unacceptable. But it's the same policy that's being applied across the board, and it's wrong and unacceptable in every case. So what we should do is use this Greek situation as an opportunity to reform Europe. Now, therefore, they're basically saying, we're not going to leave, you're going to have to kick us out. Now, secondly, what they're saying at the same time is that they'd be foolish to think that the EU would risk the existing bankers' dictatorship for the sake of keeping Greece. So the Greeks are expecting that they're not going to get the credit, and they're going to end up in a situation where they have no money to pay their salaries, no money to pay for health care. So they're looking at the BRICS. I think Tsipras is going to China next month or in May. Kamenos is going to Moscow. They've talked openly about a plan B, which is the BRICS idea. The Chinese are investing in the port at Piraeus. So the Greeks are being very responsible. They're being responsible to their people by saying, we're not going to sell you out. And the people are supporting them because of that. And they're saying to the European Union, we're going to be responsible because we're trying to solve this problem in a way that's good for the whole of Europe, not just the Greeks. Now, our job is to get the United States out of the support of the IMF and the transatlantic financial system, and to go with this whole approach that the BRICS have, in collaboration with the BRICS. In which case, what you're talking about with Greece is not that much money. But this is where the fight over principle is the real issue. So, I think the important thing is that they're being very careful before they make a decision to go with the BRICS and sever the ties with the European Union. they're trying to do what I think is the right thing, which is to change Europe. That's a tougher fight. Okay. Well, he's absolutely right. And you can see the crime being compounded by Obama's choice for Attorney General. Under Eric Holder, there was something called the Holder Memo, where he wrote a memo to Lanny Brewer, who is the #2 at the Justice Department, about this question of whether or not there would be criminal prosecutions. And Holder said that the banking system is so fragile that if one bank had officials sent to prison and criminal prosecution against the bank, it could collapse the financial system. And he not only said that in 2010, he said that in 2014. Now, Holder's on his way out, and one of the people who was responsible for making sure there were no criminal prosecutions is a New York attorney named Loretta Lynch. Lynch was the person who negotiated the criminal proceedings against Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, HSBC, for drug money laundering. in which she allowed them to plead guilty with a deferred prosecutorial agreement, which means no criminal prosecution, and paying a $1.2 billion fine. Now, that means what she said is the fact that they were laundering tens of billions of dollars of drug money, in addition to all the other crimes of HSBC. They're one of the most corrupt banks on the face of the planet, and I believe they're the largest bank in the world. Essentially, she let them off with not even a slap on the wrist. So the point is that under the present system, they're not only going to protect the bankers, but they're going to continue to provide liquidity to the banks to protect the banks. And that's not going to stop until we get the Congress to move, until we force the issue that representative government is supposed to represent the interests of the people, not the bankers. When Franklin Roosevelt came into office, he said, we're putting people before the banks. And they used something called the Pecora Commission to jail a bunch of bankers. Now, the fact that that hasn't happened today shows how terrified they are that the system could get out of control. This is also why the American Bankers Association and Jamie Dimon personally is overseeing a huge lobbying operation against Glass-Steagall. But if we could get Glass-Steagall through, then we would take away the protection racket. And that's why that's such an important fight. It's not just that it's the first of the 4 basic laws, but it's the one that opens the door to criminal prosecution, because once you force the commercial banks to let their investment banking go, and then the investment bankers have to justify all the trillions of dollars of bad debt on their books, then you would begin to be able to begin a whole series of prosecutions. And not only would bankers go to jail, but some of these banks would be shut down completely, liquidated completely. And whatever money was left after selling off all the crap would end up going to their real clients as opposed to the people who own the companies. So that just shows you how corrupt and immoral our society has become, that we've tolerated that. But that could change overnight. And the real issue is for you to take yourselves seriously there and fight for these policies in Canada. Fight for the United States to join the BRICS. Fight to get your country out of this phony war on terror into a support for this BRICS process. You know, maybe add a second C to the BRICS. So I guess that's my time for today, and I thank you for the questions. I think they were very useful and important, and I hope I've given you something to think about. Okay, bye.
Ça fonctionne. Comment? J'ai ben, de ça pour la c'est bon, ça va aussi. Parce que vous êtes fait que je t'appelle. Ok. On va recommencer.
My computer hung up. This has to be on.
Allez pas trop loin. Oh, can you just mute it for now?
Okay, but I don't know how we're.
I'll unmute it.
I know, but there's still going to be. You know how to stop the echo?
Well, if it's, yeah, I just have to not. Well, no, actually I don't. For the code, but
I don't think it'll be possible.
Okay, yeah, that would have to be plugged in.
Something like that.
No, that's not possible.
No. Okay, well I can just turn.
That's supposed to be in the mic.
No, because it's the speaker.
Wow.
I guess, yeah. Yeah, we can do that.
It shouldn't have, yeah.
I don't think so.
Ouais, je sais que oui. C'est juste parce qu'avec l'écho, avec ça, il y a l'écho.
On peut essayer sans microphone, mais...
T'as besoin de ça? T'as besoin des photos ici?
Les deux, oui. Si je peux voir l'heure, ça m'arrangerait aussi.
Là, c'est juste là?
Oui. Les machines.
Quand tu lis les citations, tu peux juste parler dedans. D'accord. Ok, c'est bon. Fait que tu me dis quand tu as besoin de lire les citations.
Il y en a beaucoup dans la première partie.
C'est bien que ça. Je peux passer. Est-ce que tu. Ok. Donc. On va ramener ça. Tu peux parler dans.
Un, deux.
Ok. Un, deux. Mike, but when this is on, yeah, echo, so I don't know what to do.
I don't know. I guess we'll just have to turn off the handrail.
Yeah.
There's no room.
Okay. Or